Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode 20 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. With me is Dr. Serhii Plokhy, director of the Ukrainian Research Institute within the Department of History at Harvard University. Besides teaching, Dr. Plokhy has also written several books on Eastern European history. Probably his best-known work is his 2016 book, The Man with the Poison Gun. It's the true story of one of the most incredible assassinations ever carried out by an unwilling assassin who'd been co-opted by the Soviet government to carry out missions in West Germany. Dr. Plokhy, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss this story with me. I just finished your book not long ago, and it contained so many amazing revelations about this story. So to begin with, can you tell me why it is that you decided to write about this particular subject and how you went about uncovering so many new details of this case that is over half a century old?
First of all, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on your program, on your show. In terms of the why did I write that book, I was interested in the subject for a long period of time. Again, the event itself, and especially later the trial of the assassin, his name was Bogdan Stashynsky, was public knowledge. So it was covered by media. Some of the details of that crime ended up on the pages of James Bond novel by Ian Fleming. So the story was there. I was interested in it. The question for every historian, for me at that point, was whether I can add anything new to that story. And I thought that, well, I can actually. I found some new materials in the recently declassified CIA archives and started working on that subject. And before I ended it, there were also new materials coming from the Soviet side, from the KGB archives in particular. So that kind of story plus sources, new sources, I don't know whether there is any historian in the world that could say no to that project. So that's the origins of the book.
Okay, that's wonderful, because it is such an exciting story, and it's good that, as I read through the footnotes, I see that you've got, great references for everything, and that nobody else has told the story like you have. So for the listeners who aren't familiar with this book already, this book is about the assassination of two Ukrainian separatist leaders in West Germany in the 1950s. And Dr. Plokhy, I know that there's a long history of conflict and animosity between Ukrainians and the Soviet government, and a lot of that is really not that well known to most people here in the United States. Can you start by giving us a little bit of an overview of what happened in Ukraine during and after World War II?
Sure, absolutely. The two leaders of Ukrainian nationalist movement that were assassinated, their names were Stepan Bandera and Lev Rebet. And they were at different times, at different points, leaders of the organization that was called Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. So it was a radical nationalist organization founded in 1929 in part of Ukraine that was at that time under the Polish rule, under the Polish control, because Ukraine during the interwar period was divided between a number of states. The Communist Russia was one of them, Poland was another, there were parts under Romania and Czechoslovakia as well. So it was in the Polish part of Ukraine that organization was founded. And the goal was the independence of Ukraine, liberation of Ukraine. It had, from the very beginning, the element of a terrorist organization as well. At least there was a branch that was involved in assassinations. And as the 1930s progressed, it also was influenced by the ideas of radical nationalism and partially fascism as well. It never was a fascist organization. The relationship with Germany were very, very complex. That's why both leaders first ended up in Polish prisons and then ended up in the German prisons, including one of them, Lev Rebet, in Auschwitz. So it was a complex story which starts in Polish Ukraine, but then becomes an issue, a problem, the organization itself, for the Soviet Union once it occupies the entire of Ukraine in the course of the Second World War. So it's a complex story, I understand. I try to present it as simple as possible in my book. But again, this is an important part of the background that one has to keep in mind when you read the book.
Right, absolutely. That was one of my favorite things about the book, is that these are very complex characters, as you mentioned, and it's easy for us to think of things in two-dimensional terms, like a Soviet assassin killing someone in Western Europe. That person must be a victim. They must be a good guy, someone we want on our side. And it was a lot more complex than that, for sure. And there was, elements of fascism, elements of terrorism there, like you said. But I'm glad that you wrote this book and that you were able to spell it out so clearly so we could understand who these real people were and what they were really all about. So how was it? Well, I guess I should ask, how dirty was their fight against the Soviets? I mean, you mentioned a little bit of assassination and terrorism. Can you talk about any specific examples of how the nationalists were carrying out these attacks?
Well, the elements of terrorism would be associated with the 1930s mostly, with the Polish rule. Once the Soviets take over the area, the nationalist movement becomes a resistance movement now for independence of Ukraine, not against the Poles or against the Germans, but against the Soviets. So it's already the third occupier within the lifespan of that generation. Most of the atrocities that are committed by the NKVD, by the predecessors of the KGB. But that doesn't mean that this Ukrainian nationalist resistance, that, by the way, continues all the way into the 1950s, longer than any resistance on the Soviet-controlled territory or in Eastern Europe anywhere. So part of the repertoire was also assassinations of the Soviet, not leaders. Leaders were protected, but certainly of the Soviet supporters and some of the most eloquent, I would say, advocates among the journalists. So one of this case of assassination again is discussed in the book. But again, there is a lot of controversy about the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists before 1945, really before the Soviets take over. After 1945, for the next 7 to 10 years, their image is basically the image of the anti-communist resistance to the Soviet control over their territory. And it is that reason, that role of the organization, that puts those two individuals on the hit list of the KGB. So it's not the Polish part, it's not the World War II part, it's not the German part. It is the continuing resistance in Western Ukraine against the Soviet control and the Soviet occupation that turns them into targets for Moscow.
Okay, that makes sense. Is there any particular reason they were targeted for assassination as opposed to simple imprisonment or kidnapping or anything like that? Was there anything that stood out? Because the Soviets, of course, they have a long history of assassination, but that's not the only tool that they have used against their adversaries. Exactly.
And the first of those assassinations that are discussed in the book happens in 1957. And the victim is Lev Rebet. At some point, he was the leader of organization in the 1930s. Again, many of them were leaders of organization for really a few months because they would be arrested by the Polish police, put in prison. So there was that period in life of Lev Rebet. Then he was arrested by Germans. He was in the Auschwitz, eventually survived. And he was the editor of the newspaper, Ukrainian newspaper, that was kind of a splinter group from the main nationalist organization. There were splits within that organization. And there was a big question of why he was chosen as a target, especially for assassination. That was also the unresolved question for me when I started that research. And what turned out was that he wasn't really, from the beginning, the target for assassination, per se. He was a target for kidnapping, exactly as you described that or mentioned before, because out of the kidnapped leader of the, even former leader, not very important maybe leader, but former leader of the organization, the Soviets can get a lot of public relations mileage. They could convince that person to testify, to somehow say things that they wanted him to say, to denounce the struggle for independence of Ukraine, and so on and so forth. But it didn't work that way, because the person who was assigned to conduct that assassination eventually thought that he was under surveillance of the Internal Security Service of the Ukrainian organization, under surveillance of the German counterintelligence. So he said he couldn't do that, and he was recalled back to the Soviet Union. So then, given that they lost that direct access to that leader, the next step was assassination. And what I learned that I didn't actually know before that, when I was working on that book, that the idea was to kill people not because in that particular case they presented any particular danger. Again, both leaders were in exile. They were not part of the active resistance anymore in Ukraine per se. So there were other reasons. And with this particular individual, with Lev Rebet, the point was that they would kill him. It wouldn't be clear who killed him. And the suspicion would fall on the other group of the Ukrainian nationalists led by Stepan Bandera, the person who was killed next. That was the original plan. So it started with exactly where you suggested, with the idea of kidnapping. It was relatively easy to do. They would bring those people in Berlin. Berlin was, at that time, there was no Berlin Wall. No really strict control between the sectors of occupation, between the Soviets on the one hand, Americans, British and French on the other. So it was easy to do that through using this loophole, this window in the Iron Curtain, and that loophole was the city of Berlin.
Okay, I see. So we've talked about the targets, Lev and Stepan. I want to ask you about the assassin himself, though, Bogdan. So how did Bogdan, he was Ukrainian himself, I believe. How did he come to the attention of the NKVD as a potential recruit?
He belonged to a Ukrainian patriotic family that was close to not so much to the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, but to this resistance movement that they led. So by the year 1950, approximately, most of the big units, the partisan groups they were called Ukrainian Insurgent Army, that they were basically dispersed. And there were smaller groups of maybe between 5 and 10 people. And one of those groups were active in the village near the city of Lviv, the major center, cultural center, including in today's Ukraine. So that group was active near the village where Bogdan was born and grew up. And his family was offering any support they could give to that resistance movement. So his sister was a fiancée of the leader of the group. His mother would basically assist when the people from this resistance group would come into the village during nighttime. So they would provide food for them, they would wash clothes for them, and so on and so forth. And they would also collect funds for them. So I don't know, maybe for the closest parallels that would be familiar to most of the readers would be the story with the Irish IRA and the support that IRA was getting among the Irish population, the civil population. So again, it's not exactly the same situation, but that would be the closest parallel. So Bogdan was involved in all of that. He knew all of those things. He was dreaming about actually joining the resistance. He was arrested one day. They had a conversation with him where they showed to him that they knew everything, actually. They knew about his involvement. They knew about the involvement of his sisters. Another sister was a courier for the underground. And they told him that, okay, either you cooperate or you will go to prison. Your entire family will be either go to prison or will be exiled to Siberia. So your call, your choice. And he signs this agreement to cooperate. Based on the materials that became available to me, it looks like that for the first maybe half of a year or up to 1 year, he was trying to play kind of a cat and mouse game with them. So he would provide them with information, but that information was not actable on anymore. He would say, okay, this and that part of the underground group were in the village on that night, and that night happened to be yesterday. So the secret police could do nothing about that. And at some point, again, that's my guess because it's not part of the documents. It looked like they caught him kind of a quote-unquote cheating on them. And that was the point where he realized that he had to prove his loyalty to the regime, otherwise he would pay for that. And he starts playing more proactive role, including going into the forest, joining that underground group while maintaining contact with the secret police, and eventually allowing or facilitating the situation in which the head of the group, who was also the fiancé of his sister, was killed. So by that time, everyone in the village kind of suspected that it had to be Bogdan Stashynsky, so this main character in the book, that was involved in that. The family cuts ties with him. He had nowhere to go after that. He admitted that during the court hearings in Germany. So he was 100% at that time. So that was year 51, 52, the KGB man. The KGB is the name of the organization that comes a little bit later, but just for simplicity, for the clarity of the discussion, he becomes a KGB man. That's also one of the titles, the title of one of the chapters in the book.
Man, that's so incredible, the power that they have over people, the level of control where they can take this patriotic young man and offer him a choice, which is really not a choice at all, to lose his entire family. And when he unwillingly goes along with it, he loses his entire family anyway, because they find out that he's been collaborating with the enemy all this time, but it was really in an effort to save them, it seems like. So what a terrible circumstance to be pushed into by NKVD, and I guess later by the KGB as well. But how did that, I have to ask, that, how do you go from someone who's being forced into this to being someone who's trusted with this solo assassination mission in a foreign country? How did he build their trust over time?
Well, one of the ways how the loyalty was built and created is that you would have blood on your hands of your people. So he had this blood on his hands of not just of one of his own people, almost member of his family, a fiancé of his sister. They then put him in the special group, the NKVD group that would be working against the underground in the mountains of Western Ukraine. And I described the really diabolic schemes that they would be involved in. One of them would have a member of the underground being captured. He would refuse to talk to them. Once they torture him, he provides some information, but it's not clear how reliable the information is, whether he is telling the truth, whether he is telling all the truth or not. So what they eventually do, they stage the following almost kind of play out there. So the group of the NKVD officers would be allegedly escorting him from one prison in one town to another. Then allegedly in the middle of that operation, their truck would break down near the village. They would stop. Then another group of the KVD men, dressed as the members of the underground, would attack this group of NKVD people. There would be allegedly a fight. They would be firing blank shots. the packages of the chicken blood would be there to show and to add in this kind of a natural flavor to that entire story. So it looks like the guy got lucky. His own people killed the bad guys and got him. But they're saying, you know what, we found the protocols and it looks like that you actually betrayed the underground. So he's now accused of betraying underground, and his only way out of that situation is to tell this allegedly members of the underground what he knows about all other operations, to prove his bona fides, that he is a real member of underground. So he tells them all of that. So once that interrogation is over, another group of NKVD people shows up and allegedly attacks this so-called group of the underground people, capture the guy back, and now they have him and they have the actually his real confession and information about what was going on. Bogdan Stashynsky and other like him members of the NKVD who came from the locals, who were recruited from the locals, were taking part in this NKVD staged operations. So again, that is just one of many examples of things that he was involved before they decided that he was educated enough, smart enough, and dedicated enough. He had nowhere to go anymore to be used abroad.
That's incredible level of planning and practice must go into that kind of operation. But it sounds like something incredibly effective to twist these guys up so much that they don't know who to trust and who to talk to and get everything out of them that way. That's really impressive.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I can't agree more. And the length at which they were going to get that confession was extraordinary. And later, that was also part of the something that I describe in the book. They became really masters of this so-called radio games, where they were setting up the groups of resistance fighters who were not resistance fighters, establishing contact with the centers of the emigration abroad, including the one that was led by Stepan Bandera, who was the second person who was killed, and really getting all the information they wanted from them. We started our discussion, you asked, okay, why those people ended up on the hit list. Bandera was, on the one hand, he was a symbol of resistance. The entire resistance to the Soviet regime were called Banderites after his name. On the other hand, he was played by NKVD through this radio game. So he wasn't a real threat in any way because all his communications with Ukraine were really under control and managed by this alleged false groups of resistance. So he was actually killed for a different reason, for really the PR reasons, because he was so important symbolically. So killing Bandera was also a major blow to quote-unquote Banderites and all supporters of Ukrainian independence, whether they had anything to do with Bandera or not, would be called in the Soviet propaganda Banderites. So that was there was a different reason for assassination of that second person. But again, the point that I want to make is that really the sophistication with which the NKVD and later KGB was playing all these games, including actually people abroad, people that they couldn't actually get to, but still they found the way how to manipulate them.
Wow. Oh, impressive stuff. So after Bogdan has proven himself after a period of time, and after the determination has been made to kill Rebet and Bandera, how exactly were these assassinations carried out?
Most of what we know about that comes from the confessions of Bogdan Stashynsky himself during the trial, but also before the trial. But I also tried to check that against the available sources to a degree possible. And those included, again, as I mentioned before, the CIA documents, the KGB documents, and even the 6-volume personal file of Stashinsky that was preserved in Ukraine, in Kiev, and became available to me after already when the English edition of the book, I was working with galleys, so I was able to put in here and there a little bit of that. But then there was another Ukrainian edition of the book where I took full advantage of this new personal file of Stashinsky. But the point is that how that was happening. So Stashinsky describes that he was invited by his control, by his handler, to the KGB headquarters in East Berlin and introduced to a person who came from Moscow. That person showed a kind of a silver cylinder that turned out to be a gun, which you would put a small pallet of glass pallet with some form, again till now secret form of poison. And the gun worked in the way that it would break that glass pallet and would spray really not the liquid, but by that time a vapor at the distance of anywhere up to 20 to 30 centimeters maybe. So what that meant was that you had to point that cylinder, that gun, into the face of the victim and pull the trigger. And they started doing that with basically pellets with water. Then the next step was that they got a dog and went outside of Berlin and ordered Stashinsky to practice on the dog. So the dog died, and there is a horrific scene of the death of the dog that Stashinsky later described. After that, it was ruled that he was ready to kill a person. He was ready to kill a man. I was describing how sophisticated these operations were of radio games and others, but I also was surprised how simple the assassination game was, in a sense that there was just one-man show, one person, who would be sent both first to collect information of where that person is and try to follow that person to figure out what the routine is, when it is happening, where would be the best place to conduct the assassination. Would come back, report, then a plan would be put together on the basis of that, and then again the same person, one person, would be sent back to that particular. In that case, it was the city of Munich, which happened to be one of the centers of the American administration of West Germany and the major center of the emigre anti-Soviet activities. So Stashinsky first really followed the victim, Lev Rebet, found out where he was living, was trying to figure out where would be the best way to commit the suicide, and eventually commits the suicide when in the stairwell, when Lev Rebet was going on the weekend on Saturday to his office in this newspaper that he was editing, and he kills him on the stairs. He was waiting for him, was going down the stairs. Rebet was going up. When they were on the same level, Stashinsky gets this cylinder, the secret gun, out of the newspaper. It was rolled in the newspaper, pulls the trigger, and leaves. Again, he was also supplied by a set of the antidote, so he was taking pills with the antidote before the operation. Some of the pills that he was taking, it later turned out that those were pills actually to calm him down, to make him more focused. Then the order was immediately get on the train, get on the plane. He was, of course, there in West Germany using false identities and false documents, and going back to Berlin. And then in Berlin, there is no border, there is no Berlin Wall yet. He would go back to the Karlshorst, where was the center of the headquarters of the Soviet military administration and the headquarters of the KGB.
So the Soviets, they employed this brand new cyanide gas gun for these attacks. But what do you think the reason was for using something so outlandish, I guess I would say, something so new, as opposed to just a gun or a knife or something much more conventional?
Well, I think they were experimenting. My best guess is that the gun itself was improved by the Soviets, but was not invented by them. it looks like that the similar ideas, at least, and things were used by the Germans, by their intelligence during the Second World War. So it's very much like the story of the most famous of the Soviet weapons, the Kalashnikov machine gun, which, again, the basic model and the people who worked on them were German experts. So in that sense, again, it's a borrowing from Nazi Germany, which was then improved. By the time when Stashinsky, 2 years later, so the first assassination took place in 1957, the second one in the fall of 1959, when he was ordered to do the second assassination, the gun was already improved and had 2 cylinders. So he could actually have 2 shots. One, the idea was that he could use against the bodyguard. There was assumption that the second target of the attack, the second victim, Stepan Bandera, would have a bodyguard. He theoretically had bodyguard, but he wasn't there at that time. So they were working on that. There was improvement. Now, they didn't know how effective the weapon would be. So they didn't know that it would be impossible later, or very difficult, to figure out why did the person die. So I explained already that the goal of killing Lev Rebet in 1957 was to cause this discord among the groups of nationalist immigration. But for that to happen, one had to identify that Rebet actually was killed. When the medics showed up, the person just collapsed on the stairs. No one saw Stashinsky. So they did an autopsy and decided that it was a heart attack, right? So it was a major failure for the entire operation. They got the guy, but they didn't get the effect that they expected from that operation. So then they decided that the gun was it became known in the literature on the subject as Stashinsky gun. People can find it now on display at the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. So Stashinsky gun is there. Then the idea came to assassinate Stepan Bandera. Again, it wasn't important to show that someone killed him. The important was to get rid of him. And it was almost by accident, actually, that forensics and then the medical officers figured out that Bandera didn't die on his own, that he was killed. The reason for that was that Stashinsky panicked and pulled both triggers of both cylinders that he had. He had this improved gun now. So there was the amount of cyanide that was in that secret substance that they used was high enough for the medics to define that actually there was cyanide. And then there was a big question. Okay, the cyanide was found in the lungs and in the stomach of the person who died. So what would be the first guess? The first guess would be that he committed suicide, right? And again, that theory was there for a long period of time. No one really knew what actually happened until later, it was already 2 years after that, in 1961, a young man shows up in the German police precinct and says that he is a Soviet KGB agent. He killed 2 people and he wants to talk to the CIA. And only after that the story comes to the surface. But again, even at that point, the CIA officers actually listen to him and they don't believe him. He described some crazy things about the gun that no one actually ever thought existed. The theories that were at that time were that someone who was close to Bandera assassinated him by putting cyanide in tea or in coffee. And here is a strange guy whose identity they can't identify, who has 6 or maybe not 6, but 3 or 4 different documents and different names on him at that time, and tells this absolutely fantastic story that he killed one guy in 1957, that no one believes that person was killed, because the person died from heart attack. Then he says that, well, that's not all. I killed also another guy in 1959. And they check the intelligence that they have, and the information is that, well, the guy died from the cyanide poisoning. So someone poisoned him. You can't, it wasn't just some random guy showing from the street and pulling a trigger. So they dump him on the West German police at the end because they couldn't identify him, do positive identification, who he was. And they never believed his story because it was so fantastic. And finally, because they had their own theory already based on their intelligence sources. And that theory was saying that there was a KGB agent close to Stepan Bandera who actually committed that crime.
Right. That's certainly more logical, because until it actually shows up, who would have thought that they'd be using a poison spray gas gun rolled up in a newspaper? That's kind of unthinkable until you've actually got it in front of you, it seems like.
Exactly. Yes.
So you mentioned that go forward to 1961 and he shows up in West Germany, but I know that the story of how he actually made it out of the East and made it over to the West side is pretty incredible in and of itself. So I'd love to go into that a little bit. I know that his fiancée, later his wife, Inga, was a huge influence on his decision to defect, was she not?
She was. And the story of his escape to West Berlin is probably even more incredible than the story with the poison gun. One thing that happened to Bogdan Stashynsky after his successful assassination of Bandera was that he became a superstar in the KGB. So the head of the KGB, Alexander Shelepin, personally invited him to come to the KGB headquarters in Moscow, briefed him on what happened, how happened, presented him with the State Award. One thing that is in the book, and I haven't mentioned so far, was that Stepan Bandera, as the leader of this resistance to the Soviet regime, was a kind of a personal enemy of Nikita Khrushchev, who was, during the Second World War, after the World War II, the party boss of Ukraine, and by 1950s became the party boss of the Soviet Union, became the leader of the Soviet Union. So for him, personally, symbolically, it was very important, this assassination of Bandera, and that the importance that was given to that operation was reflected in the way how Stashinsky was treated. The KGB allowed him to do something that they didn't allow other agents to do, and that was marry non-Soviet national. Inga Paul, with whom he fell in love, she was East German citizen. That was against the rule of the KGB, but eventually they decided to make that exception for this new superstar in the service. And that's where you see that the Soviets successfully recruited Stashinsky, but they never really convinced him somehow that the Soviet regime was somehow better than what was happening around the world. So they never turned him into committed communist. He married a woman against their wishes, a woman who was very anti-Soviet. Her mother was raped a number of times by the Red Army soldiers in 1945. There was a lot of animosity toward the Soviet Union in the family. They were also religious, so Stashinsky took this religious wedding ceremony against the wishes of the KGB. He later explained that he did that because he knew that would please his very religious parents, the parents who actually rejected him. And Inga, being anti-Soviet, actually, once she learned what was going on, that he was working for the KGB, had a really strong influence over him, saying that you look like an intelligent person, but what you are doing, what you are saying is a complete garbage. You will see this soon. This is all lies. She's very unhappy when they sent him for training and re-education in Moscow, and they decide that the next time he is sent together with her because the KGB tried to recruit her as well, would be sent abroad. The vision was that he was kind of a sleeper agent, but not any sleeper agent, but would be a sleeper assassin. So sitting somewhere in Central Europe, getting an order, kill this person, that, and then, and so on and so forth. So that was the next stage of his career that they were preparing him for. And he didn't mind at that point going abroad, but he didn't want to, at least according to his later testimonies, he wanted a different kind of job, a different line of job. He didn't want to kill anymore. And she was an important part of that story. So they decide that they will actually jump the ship. The next time they're sent abroad to West Germany, to Switzerland, they would be sent to some German-speaking, or to Austria, to German-speaking area, that they would actually turn themselves to the local police or to the American intelligence. She is pregnant. The KGB doesn't want her to be pregnant. They insist that there will be a child. They refuse to abort, to go for abortion.
Sure.
So that the relations with KGB become more and more tense. He married against their will. They keep the child now. And then, to their horror, Bogdan Stashynsky and his wife discover that their apartment that was provided by the KGB for them in Moscow, that it was bugged. And they don't know what part, if any, of that plan of escape they discussed in the apartment or not. So they're really becoming paranoid about that. And eventually the KGB, to what degree I don't know, but figuring out that they can't trust Stashinsky anymore, refused to allow him a routine trip for Christmas to East Berlin to visit his wife's family for Christmas. So they don't trust him anymore. Eventually, they decide, Stashinsky and Inge decide another plan, that she would go on her own, that she would try to say that there are some difficulties with pregnancy. The East German doctor doesn't recommend for her to come back to Moscow, so she would not come to Moscow, and she would find a way how to call him, for him to come to Berlin, and then they would escape. They work on a number of plans, including one of those plans for her contacting CIA. They create secret vocabulary, the words that they would use to exchange information. So, for example, if in the letter he says to Inge that she should go and see seamstress, that meant she should go and see CIA officers somewhere. So that was the plan, but the KGB wouldn't allow him to leave anyway. And then happens a tragedy. First of all, his son, who was born, and the KGB wouldn't allow him to go and visit son in East Berlin, son unexpectedly dies. Bogdan Stashinsky demands from his officers, saying, okay, I should go and bring Inge back, because she is in the such state of mind that she can actually go to the police. She can start talking about all sorts of things, demanding that I would come to Berlin. So let me go there. I'll calm her down. I'll bring her back to Moscow. And the head of the KGB personally, the same guy, Alexander Shelepin, who gave him the order of the Red Star for assassination of Bandera, signs off on this permission for him to go to Berlin and bring Inge back. Once he is in Berlin, he realizes that they're still under surveillance, and he knows that the moment the funeral of the son happens, both he and Inge would be taken by the KGB and shipped back to Moscow. So he decides that the only way for them to escape was on the night before the funeral of their son. So they would not be present at the funeral of their son, the son whom he never saw alive. The credible part of the story, or the most incredible part of the story, comes that once this happens, that happened on the day when the Berlin Wall, the barber This wall was built. The first incarnation of the Berlin Wall was built in Berlin. So if they would wait until the next day, until the funeral, and try to escape, then they would have to deal not only with the KGB, but with the fact that the East Berlin was already sealed. They got into West Berlin on the late night of the day, the last day, when the access to West Berlin was still open. At midnight, a few hours after they crossed into West Berlin, all the communications between East and West Berlin were closed. And that's a really, really incredible story, both in terms of the death of their child, his decision to try to escape before the funeral. The next day, the KGB officers show up for the funeral, and they see that the parents are not there, and that's where the panic starts in the KGB. Those in the know what Stashinsky did, what kind of information, potentially damaging information for the Soviet Union he possessed. So they sent two officers in West Berlin to the headquarters of the CIA in West Berlin, who were sitting there with their guns, waiting for him to kill him and, if needed, sacrifice their life in killing the traitor, but precluding him from talking to the American intelligence and to the West Germans. So yeah, it's really, really incredible story.
That is so unbelievable. And he was not aware that the Berlin Wall was going up. It was just coincidence, was it not? That was such a closely guarded secret. I can't imagine that he had any foreknowledge of it at that time.
No information whatsoever. It was just a coincidence. And it was also a coincidence that, or not coincidence, but maybe he got lucky that he was never checked by his new KGB handler in terms of the documents that he had on himself, because he was explicitly prohibited from taking with him any documents that he used in false names during his activities in West Germany. And those documents turned out to be crucial for him to pass different checkpoints in East Berlin to get to the West Berlin in general. So that was, again, a huge risk that he was taking. But if those documents would be found on him by the KGB, he would be immediately certainly arrested. So that was a situation where he and Inge certainly got incredibly lucky.
It really speaks to the paranoia of the Soviet system, I think, that someone who has received this Order of the Red Star, one of their superstar assassins, they have all these great things planned for him in the future to advance their cause, and yet he's a prisoner in so many ways. With the apartment is bugged, and he's not allowed to travel, and they don't want him to keep his child, carry the child to term or anything. So if that's how they treat their best people, it's hard to imagine how they treat people that they have the slightest bit of doubt about.
Yes. Well, there is no such thing as certainly trust. He was under control. He was under surveillance. There is an episode in the book. I picked up that piece of information in Kiev. That was part of the kind of a local lore in the KGB circles that later became public already after the fall of the Soviet Union. That there was an episode when Stashinsky was passing through Kiev to his native village to visit his parents, with whom he eventually rebuilt relations. They didn't know that he was assassin of Bandera, or didn't know that he was abroad. And he was, while passing through Kiev, he was under surveillance. and a couple of KGB officers were following him. But he was, of course, a trained KGB operative himself. So he was following others in Munich. He had this experience fighting the guerrilla warfare in the mountains of Western Ukraine. So he immediately recognized what was going on, and he ambushed one of those people who was following him and threatened to kill him and told him, okay, tell Damon, and Damon was the name of the, very interesting also, the name of the officer who was his handler in Berlin, and then became one of the key officers in this intelligence services in Kiev. So he tells this KGB guy, tell Damon that he knows who I am. If you will continue following me, I will actually kill you one by one.
Oh, wow.
So again, it's a part of the KGB lore, whether that happened or didn't happen, but it's just one more illustration of how much there was no trust in anybody and how much he actually resented that. We know that also from his testimonies when he really protested against the KGB opening the letters from Inga's relatives. That was just simply part of the routine. KGB was not treating him in any particular, I would say, kind of harsh way or unfriendly way. They were going by the book.
It's amazing that they were shocked that he eventually did try to escape and successfully escaped, and it's almost ironic that they call him a traitor when he was, betrayed by everyone, and he was treated this way for years and years and years and kept a prisoner. So he finally escaped, but they consider him a traitor to the cause after everything they've done to him.
Yes, absolutely. That was the line. And again, his original treason, again, we know under what circumstances it happened, somehow was not part of that narrative. Or the way, as you said, that he was on a certain level betrayed by his own organization, by his commanders, is also not part of that narrative.
Definitely. So you talked earlier about how he was received by the CIA and initially not believed and turned over to West Germany. So I do believe he ended up going on trial for those murders because, of course, he did kill two people in West Germany. So can you go over just the trial and the aftermath of the trial a little bit?
We already went through a number of the episodes where it's different to believe that they really happened. They're so incredible. And now we are approaching another one. So one of them is, he doesn't trust West German police. He knows that they're penetrated by the KGB. He wants to talk to the Americans. Americans don't want to talk to him because they don't trust him. So one strange situation. Another strange situation is that once he is in the German custody, he believes that his life and his survival depends on him convincing the Germans that he is telling the truth, meaning that he really killed those two people. Because if he doesn't prove that he did that, they would release him, and he would be an easy prey of the KGB. So for him, the way to survive is to stay in prison. The way to stay in prison to convince everybody that he is a criminal, that he did those killings. He tried to do that with the CIA. CIA said, no, we don't trust you. So now his hope is that the West German police would trust him. And he tries to come up with any information that could be checked. And the Germans, being quite methodical, they check all the flights and all the travel that he was doing during these years of clandestine operations in West Germany. He gives the names. He gives the names of the hotels. He gives the airlines, and they're able actually to check that was indeed the case. The major problem for him is that he can't produce this secret gun. So there is no gun with which he killed those people, despite the fact that he says that on one occasion, when one of the attempts to assassinate Stepan Bandera was aborted, he threw the gun into the stream in one of the parks in Munich. And then that was a standard operation procedure. Then once he assassinated Bandera, he did the same. So he said, okay, in this stream, that was the bridge. That's where I was throwing those. There was supposed to be at least two this top secret poison guns. And the Germans check and check again, and there is nothing. The problem is that they were cleaning that stream every year at the end of the year. So probably that went with all the dirt and disappeared. But he eventually was able to produce enough. evidence that convinced the Germans that he was telling the truth. And then he goes to the trial. It is 1962. It's the fall of 1962, more specifically October of 1962. Cuban Missile Crisis is there. The first James Bond movie is released, so a few weeks before his trial. So the atmosphere is really extremely tense, as tense as it could be during the Cold War, and he's on trial there. The trick is, again, if he withdraws his testimony, if he says that actually he gave that information under duress, the whole case is actually falling apart, because this other evidence that they produced, the West Germans produced, is not enough on its own to convict him. And his task at the trial is first to prove that he is not innocent, that he is guilty. And while doing that, somehow create a sense of sympathy toward him on the part of the jury. He turned out to be very, very certainly very capable in doing that. So there was a lot of sympathy toward him, partially because of the situation in which he was, how he was recruited to work for the KGB. He was thing that he was saying was that he certainly believed in what he was doing at that point, and that this encounter with his wife really completely changed him. So that was a believable and appealing story. When I was looking at the documents that surfaced since then from the Soviet side, from the KGB, from the intelligence archive that is now in Kiev, it is very clear that he also actually is very good at manipulating people, and what he is telling is true, but he is not telling the entire story. He never tells anybody that he was engaged in the or made possible the killing, the assassination of the fiancée of his sister. He denies that he was ever involved in the Ukrainian underground or had sympathy toward it, saying, because again, one of the arguments was that he betrayed the underground. He was saying that he had nothing to do with that. So again, it was a very selective memory and a very particular story that he presented to the judges. But he succeeded in what he wanted to achieve. First, he stayed in prison. But second, he got a very, very lenient treatment, getting only 8 years in prison. It seems to me 8 years, or maybe 7.5. I'll have to check the book, for killing of 2 people, which was kind of a scandal. And then the West German authorities were really did everything that they could, trying to hide him after he was released in prison, serving 2/3 of that term for good behavior. So he did quite well for a person who found himself in that almost impossible situation.
So he did end up going to prison, which is his ideal outcome for that trial, I guess. And after he's released, I think he moved out of Europe entirely, didn't he?
Yes, his hope was that he would talk to CIA, that there would be no trial, there would be no prison sentence at all, that he would confess, he would tell them everything that he knew about the KGB, and he would get some kind of a special treatment and would end up in the United States. But still now there are these theories that that's indeed what happened, that once he was released from prison, the CIA picked him up, they changed his face, there was a surgery, and he somewhere lives in the United States under a different name. I decided to write that book when I found a report, the CIA report on this case, coming from 1973 or 1974, and that report was saying that the CIA didn't know where he was. So that was going against this kind of established theory that CIA was involved in that, and my guess it was a cover story that was produced by West Germans. What really happened was that the West Germans convinced the government of South Africa to take him in. in mid-1980s, the former chief commissioner of the South African police gave a couple of interviews saying that actually Stashinsky was in South Africa, that he attended a wedding of Stashinsky to another woman, because we know for sure that while he was in prison, Inge Paul, the woman who convinced him to escape, actually filed for divorce. The family relations didn't survive all of this turmoil with death of child, with arrest, and so on and so forth. Inge Paul was actually, she had to change her name and went into hiding as well, because it was the journalists were after her, but also it was assumed that KGB was after her. So he ended up in South Africa, and I interviewed the General Geldenhuys. That was the name of that gentleman who published those articles in 1985. So I interviewed him in 2011, it seems to me. He didn't go into details, but he confirmed what was in those articles. I had a really strong impression that at the moment when we were talking on the phone, that Bogdan Stashynsky was still alive, and that the general knew where he was and what his name was.
Oh, wow.
Because we started that conversation on the phone, and even before, before that, there was a communication through one of the journalists in South Africa, the person who is writing a biography of that general. So eventually this telephone interview was arranged. And before I had a chance to ask my first question, the general told me, I don't know where he is and what happened to him. I talked to my colleagues. No one knows about that. He just disappeared. And I found that weird. Again, maybe I'm reading too much into that, but I found it weird that that was the first statement, even before any questions were asked, that, okay, I don't know where he went, I don't know where he is. But again, it was already close to 10 years. Badan was born in 1931, so probably he's not around anymore. But he, according to that information provided by the general, he worked for the South African police. My guess is that they used him as instructor or consultant, and what he could provide at that time was his expertise in the fighting the guerrilla warfare, because at that time South Africa moves to Rhodesia. There are the attempts to suppress the anti-apartheid movement there. And he certainly had a lot of experience with this secret operations against insurgency and underground. One of the operations that he was part of, I described to you, is this fake insurgency units and the captive being interrogated by one group, then by another. So I wouldn't be surprised if the same tactics were used also somewhere in Africa in the 1970s, early 1980s.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, he has a lot of value to contribute to an organization fighting guerrillas, because he's been on both sides of that in a sense. Exactly.
But again, I know what I know for sure, that he was involved with the South African police. What we know for sure, that he was married a woman from the city of, I hope my pronunciation is right there, Durban. That was actually the headquarters of the police special detachments that were specifically trained for the fighting insurgency.
Okay, I see. So it's possible that he's 90 years old and still down there somewhere living under a fake name. I mean, again, no one knows for sure where he is right now. He might be dead and buried, or he might still be there, still kicking in South Africa.
Yes, it's now less likely, but at the time when I had that interview with the General Geldenhuys, I thought that probably he was still around, and I then shared that my impressions with my wife, and my wife is absolutely convinced that he was alive at that time. Sure. So, but again, we don't really have any reliable information in that regard.
Absolutely. well, his life certainly took some incredible twists and turns. And I'm so glad that you were able to dig into all of this and bring this story to light, because it's absolutely riveting for sure.
It is. This summer, my first travel during the pandemic, I went to Germany, had a conversation with one of the producers of the films for the German TV, who was very interested in the story. And producing a film documentary, of course, it's important to have witnesses, and we are kind of running out of witnesses. But the gentleman really hoped that he would be able to find Inga Paul. And I hope that again, he maybe would be able to at least figure out, if she's not alive anymore, to figure out what happened to her. Because I was trying to find relatives of Inga Paul in the village near Berlin. And I didn't go there myself, but I had a very capable student assistant who went to that area. There were no relatives of Inga Paul anymore in the village, but she also looked at the records at the cemetery. At the cemetery where the son of Bogdan Stashynsky and Inga Paul was buried. It turned out that in East Germany at that time, I don't know whether that rule is still there, that if there is no one actually looking after the grave for 25 years, that grave is actually assigned for someone else can actually bury in that place. That permission was given to bury in that place 2 or 3 years before the fall of Berlin Wall. So that suggested to me that certainly there were no relatives in East Germany who were taking care of that grave. And Inga Paul, who was probably still around, couldn't visit before 1989, before the Berlin Wall went down. So it seems to me if he was buried in 1961, 25 years, it would be 86. So in 86, they gave the permission to bury in that place. In 89, the Berlin Wall went down. So again, at least my attempts to find relatives of Inga Paul didn't produce the results I hoped for. Maybe my German friends and colleagues would be more successful in doing that.
Well, you've uncovered so much already. I don't know if anyone could top what you've done so far with this story.
Well, thank you. It was really, I was almost addicted to or obsessed. Maybe obsessed is the better word for the intensity and with which I worked on that particular project, and with certainly the drive that I had at that time.
I can see why, and it produced great results. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Plokhy. This has been really fascinating for sure, and I know the listeners are going to love it. Are you working on another book right now, or what are you up to at the moment? Still teaching?
Well, I certainly teach, but I work on a number of projects. My latest book is the book on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And once again, I was able to use the KGB archives to tell the part of the Cuban Missile Crisis that was not known till today. It turned out that every Soviet ship that was bringing to Cuba missiles, equipment, machinery, soldiers, officers, more than 40,000 people altogether, every ship had a KGB officer who was then filing the reports. And those reports are now in KGB archives in Kiev, which is the biggest open KGB archive anywhere in the world. So again, that archive keeps giving very interesting information on the history of the Cold War that we really didn't know till now. And I hope that there will be more interesting discoveries in the future.
Oh, for sure. I look forward to reading that as well. So for my listeners who are interested in connecting with you, do you have an online presence? Is there somewhere that they can connect with you and learn a little bit more from you?
don't have an online presence per se. Again, I have my email, and it is on the website of the Department of History of Harvard University. So it's available. So again, if any of listeners have any suggestions, comments, or maybe leads on Stashinsky or Inga Paul, I would certainly appreciate the opportunity to talk to them.
Sure. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This has been a really, really great discussion, Doctor, and I appreciate all the insight that you've brought here. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks again for having me.
Okay. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101 or connect with me on Patreon. My patrons get exclusive access to long-form blog posts that dive deep into some of the most amazing stories in the history of espionage and receive free or discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. That includes a free PDF copy of my own book, Spy Shots Volume 1, 101 True Tales from the World of Espionage. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons, including Eli S. and Jack M. With your support, I've been able to continue funding my research and publication across multiple platforms to date. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there is lots more to come.
Thanks for listening to this program brought to you by Daydreamer Network. If you enjoyed the episode, please don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred platform. Your feedback allows us to rank on the best new shows list and continue to grow our podcasts in order to bring more unique and talented storytellers to the network. To check out our shows, including programs about relationships, sports, business, nutrition, leisure, and more, head to www.daydreamernetwork.com. We look forward to seeing you back next week for another great episode. Have a wonderful day.